All right, everybody, welcome to another live virtual weather and climate office hour. Thanks for joining me on this Monday afternoon when it is finally pretty hot again across most of California after a comparatively cool August. California and much of the West Coast has been seeing a significant heat wave in recent days, and that'll be the main focus of today's conversation, along with a slightly cooler interlude in about a week, but then probably another heat wave to follow. So August is looking like a warmer than average month across most of California and the West, in contrast to July. So I'll talk a little bit more about that context in just a minute here. I also wanted to talk or give a little bit of an update regarding wildfire excuse me, sip of water here. Regarding wildfire season, both in California and maybe more interestingly in the West more broadly, because there is a lot going on in some places that's a bit unusual at this point for August. So I'll talk a little bit more about the really active fire conditions that continue in the desert Southwest and in the southern and central Rockies, and the lack of a monsoonal pattern to really have materialized in any meaningful sense so far this year to date. And I'm typing because it actually reminds me of a link I'd like to share while I'm live here, so I just brought that up in the background. Finally, I do want to offer another federal update on the weather and climate front. There just has been a dizzying array of things going on day by day, hour by hour. I probably will miss some things that have occurred over the course of this approximately hour-long discussion today, but I do want to keep folks up to date because these updates are fast and furious. So with that, I think I'm going to dive into it and talk a little bit about the current heat wave in California. There's nothing earth-shattering, at least in California, although there has been record heat associated with this same heat wave in other parts of the West, so places like Phoenix and parts of the desert Southwest. Certainly not chilly places in August, but definitely places that are no stranger to extreme heat earlier in the summer, especially before the monsoon season usually arrives. So often the very hottest temperatures of the year in places like Phoenix will actually occur in May or June. If that sounds a little bit early, especially from a California perspective, it is, mainly because it rarely rains. There's rarely clouds in the sky in Arizona in May and June. So right around the summer solstice, you have the maximum amount of sun intensity, the least amount of clouds or afternoon thunderstorms. It's your best shot at some of the most extreme temperatures in the year, usually. Years like this year, though, where the monsoon has essentially been a complete failure, it has really not rained at all so far this monsoon season in places like Phoenix. You continue to get early summer-like heat all the way through August, which is what we're seeing now, and it's far more rare to see temperatures exceeding, say, 115 degrees, for example, in Phoenix, in August. It has been happening almost every year in June, and sometimes in July, but when we get to August, that becomes rarer because usually the monsoon is in full swing or peaking around now, and it is not this year. So we're getting record warmth in places like Phoenix right now because the monsoon pretty much is a no-show. You combine it with an anomalously but not record strong ridge for the summer, you get some record high temperatures in August. Now in California, it hasn't been as extremely hot, although compared to July, it is a lot hotter than it has been in many places. And there have still been some daily record temperatures set in recent days in parts of California, especially the southern interior and the northern and eastern interior, but it has been much warmer even as you get close to the coast. There are still some pretty cool patches right along the beaches, but as predicted with this particular heat wave, it's a lot warmer even in the coast ranges and even in that 3 or 5 mile strip from the coast. It really is just the immediate waterfront in central and northern California that has remained chilly. And even here, places like Woodley Island off the north coast, have been seeing temperatures that are near or even tying records. Now, there, a record high temperature in August for a particular day might be around 70 degrees, but it is an indication that the really cool, persistently foggy weather we've seen at the coast for much of July is not nearly as persistent right now as it was last month. And so there has been a significant shift, which reminds me of another map that I didn't pull up yet that I would like to show on screen. So that's what happens during these monologues. I think of things, and everyone gets to benefit from that stream of consciousness later in the session. There will be another day or two of hot weather before things cool down, but right now the ridge looks like it's going to re-strengthen, and by mid to late August it looks really hot again across a lot of the west. In fact, that heat wave later in August is looking a bit hotter today than it did with the outlook from yesterday. So unlike diminishing as we get closer in the predicted heat waves in the model world kind of falling apart as we saw in July, we're actually kind of seeing the opposite of that now, where heat later in August is actually looking a bit more intense than it did several days ago. So I'll talk a bit about that as well. So actually, why don't I do this? I think I'm going to start with those heat wave visuals, and then I'll take a pause and bring the wildfire visuals back up on screen. So I'm going to start right now with the screen share. And here's the big picture, quite literally in this case. This is a northern hemisphere wide map. Again, as I often show, this is a European model ensemble, meaning the average of many individual members of the same model run with slightly different perturbed initial conditions, because we don't know the exact state of the atmosphere with perfect certainty. Moving forward, this is sort of a snapshot actually of the present. So we're talking about today, when it remains quite hot in California and along the west coast, and in fact it's been nearly 100 degrees in places like Portland, Oregon. In recent years, 100 degrees has occurred quite frequently in places like Portland, but that used to be a pretty rare number up in those parts. So this is a major heat wave also for the Pacific Northwest at the moment as well, following some pretty cool weather just last week. I was actually up in Portland last week, and it was pleasantly cool, and it even rained on one day, although that is now definitely in the rear of your mirror as these quite hot temperatures are now in play up there. Just changing the color here so it's a bit more contrasting. So here's the ridge of interest centered over the northeastern Pacific. You can kind of see that there's a bit of an extension of the ridge axis right along the west coast, which is where the hottest temperatures have been recently. But I'm going to step this forward in time, so from a present snapshot to a prediction. You can see that the ridge weakens and shifts westward as the week goes on. By the time we get to Thursday, we actually have some weak troughing along the west coast, a low pressure system potentially even trying to move in over the Pacific Northwest. Could get some rain up in Washington from this, probably not into Oregon or Northern California, so this will only be up in Washington. But it will bring cooler, breezier conditions, probably reduce fire risk up in the far Pacific Northwest, BC and Western Washington, but will probably increase it across Oregon and far Northern California as no rain but breezy winds following a heat wave occur in this region. That's a common pattern where we see further uptick in wildfire activity. We see that low kind of lingering, that trough, as we get into early next week, so about a week from now. No heat wave in California, although we see the beginnings of the next heat wave already starting to build over the southwest and the mountain west as the western flank of that Four Corners Ridge starts to build up again as that trough offshore persists. And then that, you can kind of see where we're going with this. That strong ridge once again redevelops across the desert southwest and builds on its northwestern flank all the way across California and once again across the Pacific Northwest as we get past August 20th. And that kind of sets the theme for the rest of the month, in fact, with anomalous ridging of some strength really along the west coast. Notably, more so than the ensemble average and the ridge strength, the main thing I want to point out is the absence of a trough here, as we saw for much of July. So this is looking like a pretty different pattern with widespread subtropical anomalous warmth and ridging in the atmosphere extending along the west coast more often than not over the next couple of weeks. We will have a brief cooler period, but as I'll show, during that cool period, here's where we are right now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the Western U.S. Here's where we are right now with much above average temperatures inland over this 5-day period. There are some cool patches along the coast, although again, as I'll show in a moment, this is a bit exaggerated due to some data anomalies. But the more important part is that as we step forward through time, we do indeed see some cooling, further cooling across inland parts of California. In particular, note how Mount Shasta and the mountains are no longer anomalously warm as we get into early next week. But look what happens as we get later into August. This is actually a very strong heat signal for 2+ weeks out. We see quite a strong heat signal for Southern California, including coastal Southern California, all the way to the beaches now, which has not really been happening as much this year. Northern Sacramento Valley, Northern Mountains hot again, San Joaquin Valley, Snake River Plain, really the whole west. And importantly, we see a large blob of anomalously warm air at the surface offshore, which is the opposite of what we saw earlier this year. If we look at the American model's representation of the same period, we actually see an even clearer picture where that near coastal coolness is even weaker, and we see this just very broad, widespread warm pattern across the west. So this looks like where we're headed. And also, in terms of precipitation, while you look through the period, no surprise here, not much to speak of in California. Maybe some isolated southern Sierra thunderstorms, and maybe an isolated thunderstorm in the southeastern deserts or mountains, but really not much else. All of this, of course, is just scattered marine layer drizzle. No meaningful precipitation across California the next couple of weeks. Some precipitation in the southwest along the Mogollon Rim and along the crest of the central and southern Rockies, but really not all that much, considering that this is the wettest time of the year in some parts of the desert southwest, and we're not really going to see it. The Great Basin in particular really looking moisture starved, and that's going to continue for the next couple of weeks. Just to drive that point home, you can see that we do, as I mentioned, we get that nice precipitation up in western Washington this week, which is a nice boost that is a little bit unusual for August. Doesn't really extend into Oregon and Northern California, but then we see that we transition to drier than average conditions even up there, sort of offsetting that as we get into the next week, and drier than average conditions continue across the Rocky Mountains in the southwest. So that's not great news in the context of wildfire risk, which will be my next topic here. Oh, and by the way, I will take a pause to answer questions live in between the wildfire section and the federal update section, and then answer questions again at the end of that. All right, so here is a live satellite image of the, I guess, broader western central U.S. It's a pretty wide view, but there's a few things I want to point out here. One is that this is a surprisingly cloudless picture across much of the southwest for mid-August. There would usually, you can see some thunderstorms, isolated thunderstorms firing along the Mogollon Rim and along the crest of the southern Rockies, but that ain't much for what would normally be the peak of monsoon season, where you'd often see thunderstorms prevailing all across this region. The skies are, except for some wildfire smoke, remarkably clear across the entire state of Nevada, the entire state of Utah, except for what I'll zoom in for, a wildfire plume, and even in Colorado, where there's a few clouds, but also a lot of smoke. So here, I'm going to zoom in on a few different locations. First, I'm actually going to zoom in on Colorado, because some of the most active wildfires at the moment, this might not be quite the view that I wanted. I want the sub-regional sector here, and I can get several fires at once. You can see some major wildfire plumes. This one in southwestern Colorado, this one in western Colorado. This is now one of the top 5 largest wildfires in Colorado state history, I believe. Another very active fire up in northern Utah, and this is the Dragon Bravo fire. It's been burning for weeks along the north rim of the Grand Canyon. It's now spread over 30 or 40 miles to the north of the Grand Canyon, so this is now one of the larger fires on record in Arizona history. And you can also see some newer wildfires popping up along the southern rim in Arizona. A little bit easier to see the scope of these fires. You bring up the thermal infrared imagery, and here I think it's pretty obvious where the fires are. You can see this one, you can see this one, you can see this one, this one, this one, and there's a couple others covered by clouds. But you get the idea. It's a pretty active period for wildfire in this region. Go back to true color and now head over to California, specifically Southern California. There are multiple active wildfires, but there's really only one that's putting up a significant smoke column today, and it has been every day. It's been active day and night above the marine layer, and this is burning in the infamous the LPF, the Los Padres Forest, and it's right here. I'm going to bring up the infrared again, and it's hot enough. It's hot enough that the signal gets washed out a little bit on infrared, but you can still see it here, burning hot and bright for much of the day. If I bring up the Watch Duty app again, zoom in here. This is the Gifford fire. It's quite large. It's now well over 120,000 acres, and it's spread. You can kind of see along the approximate axis of the topography here. So generally, like this. And quite honestly, it's still got a lot of room to grow. It's actually moving into some region with no known fire history, so the fuel loading is extremely high, following several wet years and no observed fire activity in decades in some region. It's actually quite a broad region of evacuation warnings and orders. This is a huge region, although it does not necessarily a very populated region. So huge area and not a tremendous number of people, although a couple of regionally important highways are within the corridor. This fire is likely going to be around for a while. It's been affecting air quality on the central coast especially, but also occasionally in other regions. This fire is reasonably contained on some flanks, but quite uncontained on others, and is likely to continue to be active, especially during windy and hot periods, but since it's at an elevation that's above the marine layer, above the inversion, perhaps even at other times as well. So that's one significant fire. The canyon fire is now, I believe, largely contained. That was in a more populated area. I do think it burned a few structures, but not a large number of them. That one is largely managed. There's a couple of other fires, as you can see, although none of these are particularly threatening at the moment. And there's other fires that have popped up, some grass and brush fires in the Bay Area, the western flank of the Sierra Nevada, up in Lake County. There's been fires. Looks like there's a new one going on, the coal fire right now. Bring up the Kelseyville camera. You can see that one. It's actively burning. It doesn't look particularly extreme. It looks like a little bit windy out there, though, so the wind is always a bit of a challenge. And other fires. Some of these are still the big lightning fires from a few weeks back up in Northern California. Again, these are fairly large fires, 19,000 acres, 20+ thousand acres, but they're not moving too quickly. Some of them are actually nearing or have achieved containment. And as you'd expect, up in the Pacific Northwest, a bunch of new fires today up in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho amid the highly anomalous heat up there. Obviously, Western Washington will be helped out by that upcoming rain, but down in Oregon, not so much. They're just going to get the wind and not the rain. And you can see the numerous fires along the rim and south of it in Arizona, along the central and southern Rockies, and in New Mexico and Colorado and Utah, and also a couple of fires now up in Wyoming. So it's a pretty active period. California, not crazily active except for the really big fire right now in Central California, just inland to the Central Coast, the Gifford fire, which is huge, but not necessarily threatening a lot of populated areas. If we can get, I don't know if we have a good live camera view here. That's looking into one of the burned areas. That's a less active flank of the fire currently. Let's see if we can find a more active portion. The fire has burned through some of these camera views, actually. This one looks a little more, you can kind of tell. Alright, this one might actually be, this is probably the closest camera with some significant activity. You can see the plume. Yeah, you can see the fire activity here. Clearly it's a large fire. It's active on multiple flanks, and as you can see, these pockets of fuel go up. This is not quite as active as it has been in recent days, but it's large enough that it's responding to the weather pretty rapidly. And again, here's another camera view. You can see it actively burning through quite rugged and remote terrain. Not doing anything too crazy at the moment that you wouldn't expect in these heavy fuels, but it continues to burn. And the outlook for the next couple of weeks is that, well, there'll be that cool down, but the trade-off with the cool down is it will be windier, so that may cause fires to spread before it once again gets hotter. And there is still a significant risk of lightning-ignited fires because there hasn't been much monsoon precipitation across the whole Southwest, so lightning is still igniting a lot of fires, more than would usually be the case in August. And I thought I'd pull this last map up just to show right now. There's a few locations in California that are near record highs for the day. Mount Shasta, Mojave, the 29 Palms, Needles, and the Mammoth Lakes, June Lakes. But nothing that's actually breaking the record, so, you know, it's obviously warmer than average, especially inland and higher elevations, but nothing earth-shattering. A bit different story, by the way, in the northeastern U.S., where there are quite a few places breaking records, and up in Maine and in Newfoundland, there are actually places that are currently experiencing their hottest August temperatures on any August day on record. So that's a very notable heat wave up in that part of the country at the moment. Earlier today, by the way, much of southern Europe experienced its single hottest day on record in any month. So yet another record-breaking heat wave in places like Spain and the south of France, with major record-breaking wildfire activity in those regions currently as well. And just to drive home a couple of additional points, one is if we look the past, let's call it the past 90 days, that gets us back to, or let's just call it the last 60 days for more monsoon season, June through, and let's talk about precipitation, and let's actually look at the precipitation anomaly in percent. What you can see is across the West, this has actually been a really unusually dry period. Obviously, along the California coast, June through August is usually a dry period to begin with, so take those numbers with largely a grain of salt. But in this region here, the last month or so is actually should be one of the wettest times of the year. So when we're seeing precipitation under 50% and in many cases under 30% of average, that's a pretty alarming lack of precipitation. You can really see that the wildfire activity is almost sort of outlined by this very low failure of the monsoon area. You can see Phoenix there under 30% of average precipitation for the monsoon to date. The Colorado Plateau region widely under, and locally there's been essentially no rain at all. The whole Great Basin, the southeastern California deserts, the central and southern Sierra. The northern mountains of California have done okay with these isolated thunderstorm downpours. They've been pretty heavy, although localized in recent weeks, but they haven't been super widespread. It's really just this one pocket of California. The rest of California has been dry, as has the Southwest. So this is sort of where we are from a non-soon perspective. And then here is where we are with ocean surface temperature anomalies. I got to change my arrow color again because this is kind of a crazy map. Bring up the magenta. The whole North Pacific is essentially on fire. These are incredible warm anomalies in the northwestern Pacific near Japan. In fact, Japan has been experiencing all-time record heat and some all-time record rainfall. Just phenomenally warm, greater than 5 degrees centigrade. Where's the scale on this? I'm trying to find there it is. You can see that's above 5 degrees centigrade. So once we get into the black here, this is getting close to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than average oceans. That's incredible. Same thing up in I think up in some of the Arctic Ocean peripheral seas. But even in the North Pacific, the Gulf of Alaska, we're starting to see 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, so think 5+ degree Fahrenheit warm anomalies. That's really, really warm. There is this cool swath in the subtropics from Southern California out toward Hawaii, but that's pretty much it. The rest of the Northern Hemisphere oceans are super, super warm right now, and as is much of the Southern Hemisphere and the Indian Ocean as well. But if I zoom in a little bit on the California coast region, what you can see here is that there remains, especially on the central coast, a blob of unusually cool water. But look how close this huge region of extremely warm water has gotten to the California coast. Back in July, the easternmost extent was here, and as July went on, it came closer and closer and closer as we got into August. Now it has nearly reached the coast. There's still little pockets of upwelling, but even here, the water right off of LA and Orange County, warmer than average locally. The water right off the north coast is now warmer than average. We saw that record high at Woodley Island. So there's pockets of upwelling. You can kind of see it swirling around, but we're losing that super cool water along the coast. So that's going to be less of a factor in all likelihood moving forward with the heat waves for the rest of the season. All right, so I'm going to bring, I think, myself back full screen here, take a look at some questions before I launch into the final section here. Okay, there's a question about Atlantic hurricanes. I am going to try and keep the questions answered today to the topic at hand so we get through the session in the hour. So perhaps a different day. Just reading through the comments here. So there's a question, JC from Salt Lake City. Could you comment on the critically low Great Salt Lake level and also clarify cyclical drought versus long-term aridification? So, yes, we've been having quite a severe long-term drought, and by long-term I mean multi-decadal, so not just this year, last year, or a few years, but decades. That has been recognized by folks who study paleoclimate, the climate going back hundreds or even thousands or tens of thousands of years, the climate of the past essentially, as a mega drought in the context of multiple millennia. So this is a hugely significant extreme aridity event for much of the interior Southwest. Now, here I'm not so much talking about central and northern California. This is a Colorado River Basin. So it does include parts of California, but maybe the far southeastern part of California. So the part where very few people actually live. But this affects more other states like Arizona and Nevada and Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and northern Mexico as well, at the terminus of the Colorado River into the Gulf of California. And this drought has been just incredibly persistent. And recent evidence suggests that about half, and today possibly slightly more than half, of the magnitude of this mega drought has been contributed by the long-term climate change warming trend in temperatures directly. So that's not to say that there has been an effect necessarily on the regional average precipitation and that has decreased as a result of climate change, but it has more to do with the fact that even if you say that the decrease in precipitation we've seen in recent decades, which is significant in this region, is essentially caused by some natural cycle, and it might be, although there's some emerging evidence that perhaps even this has some climate change fingerprints, but let's just assume for a moment that it doesn't, that the decrease in precipitation is entirely because of a natural cycle, Pacific Ocean cycle, Pacific decadal oscillation, or something like that, which is possible. Even under that assumption, which is the assumption that these studies have made, about half of the magnitude of the drought we're seeing is actually due to human-caused warming, because it is so much hotter than it used to be. The evaporation or potential evaporation is so much greater because that evaporative demand rises exponentially for a linear warming. Remember that expanding atmospheric sponge I keep talking about. That there has just been this profound loss of water in the West. This is not to say that humans have been using more and more water and that's why it's gone. That is also a problem. The groundwater overdraft, the pumping, the consumptive use of water for various purposes, agriculture, cities, whatever it is, that has made the problem worse. And there's a long history for those who study the water in the West that the historical allocations, which were kind of arbitrarily assigned, frankly, those water rights holders in the Southwest, they were collectively assigned more water than actually was ever likely to exist. So it's like promising a slice of pie to 30 people when there's only 20 slices of pie to begin with. And that's part of the problem why we see the effects of this drought being as bad as they are. But when I talk about drought, I'm not talking about the fact that there's a lot of human use of that water. That is a very related but separate problem. But meteorologically speaking, there is an enormous deficit of water in this region in recent years, the mega drought, half caused by increasing evaporative demand by the warming itself, the other half caused by the decrease in precipitation, which has widely been viewed as largely not directly related to climate change, but recently perhaps there's a bit more evidence that it is. But the point is, it is dry out there. I've been going to Salt Lake City and the Great Salt Lake at least occasionally every few years now, probably since about 2007 or 2008 for various reasons. And in that period, especially as somebody who's not there all the time but gets to see it episodically with a few years in between, it's been pretty shocking to see just how much that lake has receded in that time. Antelope Island, for example, was legitimately an island the last time I was actually on Antelope Island, and today, so far as I know, last time I was there, it's no longer an island because the lake has receded so much that the land surrounding the island is now dry. You can walk on it, just a dry, salty crust. This is a problem for water, of course. Salt Lake City in central Utah is home to a lot of people these days. It's a growing metropolitan area, rapidly growing, but also because some of the deposits, the mineral and salt deposits in the lake bed itself, are potentially pretty toxic if they're aerosolized, and it's a dry and windy place, so they will occasionally be blown around with a couple million people in immediate proximity. So those potentially toxic compounds can be a problem as well. So there is a role played both by the you could call it cyclical, although I would call it natural because it isn't really cyclic. It doesn't follow any particular cycle. It may not be caused by human warming, but it is the random variations of the atmosphere and the oceans and their coupling. There is a role for that in the Southwest megadrought, both in Utah and elsewhere, but also a profound and growing role for climate change, and the evidence suggests that it's about half and half. The key part, though, is that moving forward, it's pretty likely that the climate change component will then be the single most important factor, as the amount of warming over time further increases. The natural cycles are still natural cycles, and they're still going to go back and forth, but climate change is going in one direction only. So that's kind of what we're thinking about in terms of the bigger picture there. It's a good question, though. Christopher mentions that fall is coming. It's been cold in Fairbanks. Well, fall does come early to the Alaskan interior, and we are getting into mid-August, so summer there peaks quite early. Coastal California has a very late summer, if you will, in terms of temperature, often starting in August and peaking in September or October. When you're that far north, the days get shorter quickly, the temperatures get cooler quickly, and come late August, you never know exactly what's going to happen. It's one of the things about living in the north. Bonnie asks, is losing the cool water near the coast something that normally happens in the summer? It is in the late summer and early fall, as I've talked about before, as upwelling decreases. So the upward vertical movement of cold water from deeper ocean layers is common. It's along the northern and central California coast. It's why San Francisco is famous or infamous for its chilly fog that takes tourists by surprise in June, sometimes in July, like this year. But it does usually begin to fade by August and September, which is one of the reasons why coastal California sees its hottest temperatures of the year most years, not at the peak of summer, but after the peak of astronomical or solar summer in August, September, or even October some years, because that fog goes away because the upwelling decreases. Now, we had stronger than usual upwelling and cooler than average near-shore temperatures for much of the summer so far. What we're seeing now is that the unusually strong upwelling and unusually cool temperatures have now faded and dissipated. So now we're near seasonal average levels, which is already decreasing. What I would expect to see in the next few weeks is actually a further trend towards even weaker than usual upwelling and even warmer than average temperatures as we get through the next few weeks. So that would argue for a pretty warm late August, September, October. And there is evidence we're already headed there. If the current forecast holds, August will indeed end up being a significantly warmer than average month for the state overall and for most regions away from the immediate coast, and in Southern California, probably extending all the way to the coast too. So for all of California, except for portions of the central coast, even the north coast, are probably going to end up warmer than average as well. So it is an increasingly narrow zone. Okay, so I want to move on now to the final section of this session today. Let me take a sip of water and then I'll get back to it. I want to offer, as I have been, another federal update is what I've been calling them, both because it's literally what it is and it's also a little bit of a euphemism for other terms that I might use in my private life to describe what is actually going on. But I have there are so many things happening, I do have to write them down because it's a dizzying array. So you'll see me referring down to my handwritten lined paper notes where I try to read my own terrible handwriting. So you've probably heard in recent weeks that the U.S. EPA has announced that it's going to rescind the endangerment finding surrounding greenhouse gases that was first made in 2009 and has provided the basis for essentially any federal regulation of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, the causative agents of global warming, that we have done in the past decade and a half, I suppose it's been. And in so doing, essentially end all federal regulation of said greenhouse gases, of said global warming, climate change causing greenhouse gases in this country. And also that would have major implications for individual states' ability to regulate on their own. So this would potentially, in some cases, make it impossible for some states to have more stringent regulations than the federal government, which is itself moving to make it impossible to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant. That's the reason why that's been in the news. That's what the endangerment finding means. Essentially, it meant that CO2, carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas, which is the main one involved in global warming, although not the only one, was a regulatable pollutant legally in the U.S. because it caused harm. Hence the term endangerment finding, that this particular constituent causes harm. If the argument is that this in fact doesn't cause harm, the corollary is then that the EPA and the federal government cannot regulate it as such. In accordance with this, there was a report released by the EPA articulating its internal reasoning for rescinding the endangerment finding, and there was also a follow-up report, not totally clear on why it was produced by the Department of Energy, but that is where it came from, written by only 5 people in a very short period of time, and was released recently. It's currently out for in draft form for public review. In fact, you can submit your own public comment that the DOE is supposed to respond to. I will be doing so in my professional capacity in the next couple of weeks. The deadline, I believe, is in late August or early September. I don't recall the exact date. But the main reason I raise this is that this is a hugely consequential decision, and the documents that have been released by the federal government articulating justification for rescinding this finding are... You can sense that I'm genuinely at a loss for words. They are so wildly inadequate for the purpose of overturning such a monumentally consequential decision that it is remarkable that these documents, I think, were published at all, because they are, quite frankly, a national embarrassment. The documents provide an incredibly skewed view of the modern science of climate and weather and greenhouse gases. And is it not reflective in any substantive way of what the overwhelming body of scientific research indicates? In fact, I was reviewing both of these reports, the EPA report and the follow-up DOE, believe it's called a critical analysis report, today, in responding to some journalist queries about them. And I was actually they're hundreds of pages long, but I was just picking out specific claims that were demonstrably false using what I would call elementary school level arithmetic. Just claims that are so obviously mathematically impossible. Like temperatures haven't risen in the U.S., or sea level hasn't significantly risen, or separately, it hasn't significantly accelerated its rise, or that there has been no change in wildfires. All of these statements are just self-evidently not true. But the bigger picture on these reports is that there are many studies cited, including former National Climate Assessment reports, which are a congressionally mandated report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, the IPCC semi-regular reports, and many individual papers on various climate and greenhouse gas related topics. But the references in some cases are or I would even go so far as to say, as in most cases, are deeply misleading and out of context. So the classic examples of cherry picking, which is to say using a source or a fact out of context, or in a way that is not as the authors intended, to make almost the opposite argument of what the evidence actually shows, even in those very papers and resources. In some cases, authors who have responded publicly in the media have reported that that these reports actually get the contents of the cited papers completely wrong and are just factually not correct. So there's a preponderance of cherry picking, but in some cases the references are simply wrong, and in at least a handful of cases the references appear to be to papers that do not actually exist at all, which is curious in our era of AI that can hallucinate references. That's as far as I'll go down that path for now, but suffice it to say, these reports are not anywhere close to an adequate basis for justifying abandonment of the endangerment clause, and climate scientists are actively working to form a coherent community response to these reports, which is very frustrating because, quite frankly, there are more important things that we really should be focusing on right now. But in this moment, it is unfortunately also important to mount a public response to this hugely consequential decision that is likely to move forward anyway, despite what we actually the public comments that we make, but I do think it's important to understand that these are not substantive documents. There's been no preponderance of evidence since 2009 that has overturned the overwhelming opinion that greenhouse gases are responsible for a great deal of harm, not because they are acutely toxic to breathe in. We all, of course, every plant and animal in the world inhales or uses carbon dioxide in some form every single moment of every single day, but through their effect on the global climate system, through their effect in producing global warming and increases in extreme heat waves and extreme downpours. We've seen so many of those just this summer, extreme wildfires, things like this. And the notion that the evidence somehow has gotten weaker since 2009 is just so ludicrous as to be bold, I guess I would say, to even try and make that argument, because it's so obviously not true. So I won't go into the details of that report except to say that's something that we're working on, and if you've been hearing about it in the news right now. Related to that is the announcement late last week that the federal government has plans apparently to, as you may know, they've already canceled the upcoming National Climate Assessment. Again, the congressionally mandated update to that report, largely conducted by volunteer authors. But now they've announced that not only will they not be moving forward with the next one on the mandated timeline, but they will also be going back and altering previous reports. So they will actually be going back and removing or rewriting sections of the document according to political priorities. So that's pretty shocking in terms of revisionism, literal historical revisionism. That's a considerably more concerning step even than canceling the ongoing reports. Now, of course, you can obtain a copy from any number of sources of the original reports in their unaltered form. But the notion that you can go all the way back into the early 2000s and just rewrite the consensus scientific views from over a decade ago is pretty concerning. Not just as a precedent-setting move, but also just in why you would even spend the time doing that in this moment, rather than addressing any of the numerous problems that have come. That have arisen in the meantime. The analogy of putting your head in the sand. This is maybe even going a step further than just burying your head in the sand. This is, I don't know what the analogy would be to go one step further down that chain. But that is an announcement that was made last week that I found to be just jarring, even in the context of what we already know about what's going on. Another update, as we know, FEMA has been decimated. There is now confirmation that in the wake of disasters, and there have been plenty already this summer, many of them have been flood disasters in the U.S., that FEMA is no longer able to show up in a timely fashion. FEMA personnel have been showed up late or not at all in the wake of recent disasters, again, especially these numerous flash flood disasters. There was yet another one yesterday, by the way, in Milwaukee, the most extreme rain event ever observed there, and severe urban flash flooding once again, and in southwestern Florida once again. Again, this is just the last 48 hours. Flash flood summer continues. FEMA, though, not able to respond in a timely or effective manner. This includes at least in the case of Texas, back in July, in that tragedy, it's now come out that the urban search and rescue teams, which Swiss water rescue teams, that would normally have been deployed very quickly or even pre-deployed, were not in place until after the rescue mission trying to save people's lives would have become inevitably a recovery mission days later. So that was a consequential and potentially deadly delay. The other thing that's happening is that funds for community recovery are not being dispersed, so communities are not recovering. And the most recent announcement was that a number of FEMA employees, again, there are still rumors that FEMA may cease to exist as soon as next month as a federal agency. But in the meantime, it sounds like a large number of FEMA employees who are tasked specifically with responding to disasters and physical hazards like floods and wildfires or earthquakes, or even something like a terrorist attack, any event that results in large-scale disruption or harm or damage, are now mandated instead to be enforcers of U.S. immigration law and of deportation. So forcibly moving people who presumably had a job that was explicitly tied to the protection of American life and property and economic well-being, and mandating that these very same folks, if they wish to continue in FEMA, now have to be involved moving forward in immigration law enforcement and deportation. Also, within the past week, is what is difficult to characterize in any way other than a ransom note from the executive branch, directed specifically toward UCLA, and by extension the University of California system in general, $1 billion ransom note. In terms of the numbers, 1.1 billion actually, if you count all of the contingencies attached to it. And there's a litany of highly partisan political demands, essentially that are demanded in this extortion letter. I don't relish using this language, by the way, but it is. I struggle to use accurate English words to describe what it is in any other way than I'm currently doing. Essentially saying that if UCLA does not impose all of these dramatic new policy shifts, and it's really a laundry list of partisan political demands. There isn't even really any one thing, but it involves everything from rules about who can use what locker rooms in the athletic department to who can live in what dorms and what HR policies are and what you're allowed to say publicly on campus and academic freedom. So it's a lot of important things, but they're just all over the map. But the point is, this ransom note is essentially, if you don't do this, then you're going to lose $1 billion with a B. And to UCLA, that's a big number. To the UC system at large, even, that's a really big number. And there is grave concern over what it would mean for the ability of UCLA to continue to function, even. And what the outfall would be for the rest of the University of California system here. And so it's still not fully clear, I think, exactly how this is going to play out. And I'm not going to speculate. I'll point out that my employer is, in fact, the University of California, although these days not UCLA. Again, my main affiliation is with UC Agriculture and Natural Resources. But the initial indication is that UCLA and the University of California system and the state of California are not going to immediately concede in this moment. We'll see how this plays out. And there's been a mix of responses. Other universities have faced similar demands in the past several months and have taken very different paths. Some have essentially conceded and paid the ransom. Others have not. And in other cases, there's sort of been a blend of approaches. Although I will also note that, to my understanding, this is the largest quantitative demand yet in terms of $1 billion. I think this greatly exceeds even what Harvard or Columbia were facing. And this is on top of, by the way, the hundreds of millions of dollars of research funds that may or may not be in various levels of being frozen or rescinded. It's very chaotic and unclear right now. But this is actually separate from that and in addition to that. The reason I raise this is just to emphasize that the University of California system is an integral part of California, of modern California. It's part of why California is what it is today. There are so many people who work for or work with the university who have a degree from the university or who have family members who either work for the university or have degrees. who use the University of California system hospitals, think UCSF, UCLA, and many others, UC Davis, or who benefit from the agricultural technologies, for example, that are now widely used in the breadbasket, as it's sometimes called, of the United States, or your favorite fruit or vegetable or nut milk likely is what it is today on some level because of research and outreach through the University of California campuses or the agricultural extension through UC A&R. Silicon Valley, the tech world, you work at Google, you work at Meta, the AI companies that are coming into the fore. A lot of those people have University of California degrees. A lot of that technology came out of the University of California. The film industry, how many famous film directors and actors and other folks went to UCLA or somewhere else in Southern California? So it's remarkable just how destructive these kinds of demands are and how overtly politically partisan they are. It's one thing to have a conversation about ideological differences. It's one thing to shift funding priorities in an orderly way, using the congressionally mandated route to do so, which is typically the way this is supposed to work and the way it's worked historically. But it's kind of an extraordinary moment, and it's potentially a hugely consequential one, not just for UCLA, but for the University of California system in general, and also for the state of California as a result, because the University of California is such an integral part of how the state functions as it does today. And so I'm not even sure I have a conclusion to this particular reflection, because we will see how this plays out. And unfortunately, none of the outcomes are we're better off than we were before, but there's a very wide range of how bad could it be versus how bad maybe that it isn't, depending on how this goes and how we navigate it and how the university system navigates it and how the state navigates it and all of this. And so just to point out, none of this is normal. None of this is routine. None of this is ordinary. None of this is according to procedure or policy, or even appears to be related to any particular specific grievance that is rectified by any of the demands that are in this letter from the executive branch. And by the way, I already see there's a couple of comments. Where would this money be going? It's a direct demand that UCLA pay the federal government at large to the general fund. That is literally the demand. So it's a strange moment, and I know it sounds weird. It feels weird to be saying all of this out loud. But I just think it's important for folks to be aware, and this is probably the farthest afield from weather and climate that these federal updates have gone recently. But the thing is, it's not really far afield from weather and climate, because everybody at UCLA, which has a world's famous atmospheric science department, who has federal funding, which, to be honest, is almost everybody in the department, is potentially going to lose their funding immediately. And think of what the knock-on effects are, by the way. If researchers, anyone from a graduate student to a postdoc to a tenured member of the faculty, I am neither of those things these days, by the way, I'm the some fourth thing, but imagine what happens if your funding is temporarily even interrupted and you don't know when it's going to come back. The university does not have an infinite supply of money to front their staff and their researchers. So even if you assume that 3, 6, 9 months from now this gets worked out and is resolved and largely forgotten, the problem is this. A lot of the damage is going to be done in the meantime as the lawsuits, as the political theater plays out. People will lose their jobs, research projects will be ended, and that will be the end of those things. They're not going to come back as they were. The people won't come back. The research is not going to be resurrected. There are people in research labs, universities all across the country who have had to euthanize lab animals or end decades-long longitudinal research projects because already the interruption has been long enough to make the data useless to have to sell the equipment and sell and let go the personnel. You can't just restart those things the day the funding returns, assuming it does. So a lot of the harm is going to be done in the meantime, and I think that that's really important to understand, that it's not just the net loss looking back a year or two from now, but it's the harm from the disruption, from the chaos, from the discontinuity, from the uncertainty, and yes, the brain drain that's going to happen in the meantime. So part of my hope is that whatever resolution there's going to be is as quick as possible, as well as complete as possible, because the longer this drags on and the more people who get caught up in this, the more harm there's going to be to California. And I hope the state government steps up. I hope the governor's office, steps up as much as it can and offers alternatives. But the reality is, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of funding, and you can't single-handedly decide to fund the entire University of California system internally on a dime. 5 or 10 years from now, maybe there's an alternative vision for how a state-run university system could look. But for now, we're in this moment where discontinuity is going to be very, very disruptive indeed. And I sincerely hope that the resolutions are rapid as we possibly can get in this kind of wild and crazy moment for so many reasons. All right, so I'm going to take a quick look at the comments here. One last thing. Oh, and one other thing I would mention is I also earlier today published a video monologue. It's about 15 minutes long, so longer than a TikTok video, but a lot shorter than any episode of streaming TV, to put it into contemporary perspective, on my personal thoughts on 1.5 centigrade global mean warming as a temperature target as it relates to the Paris Agreement and the fact that we're on track to blow right past that. So an honest and unvarnished perspective, 15 minutes of me talking directly to the camera. If you want to know what I really have to think about it, go check it out. And I'm sharing that link right now in the chat. You can also go to the Weather West homepage and find it pretty easily. You might recognize I'm wearing the same shirt as I am right now because I recorded that just a few hours ago. So okay, so the questions here, let's see. I appreciate, by the way, folks in the comments section today, including folks I know who are not in full agreement with some of the stuff I'm saying, particularly in the latter third of this discussion, are staying respectful and respecting other people's space and opinions in the comment section. That is really helpful, and so thank you for that. We're only that the standard. There's an interesting question from Marty about it's funny how LinkedIn has become surprisingly reemerged as the pinnacle of cultural relevance in this fractured social media moment, but it is, there's some truth to that, regarding just how dire things are with respect to insurance and the future of capitalism. I think in the context of increasing disaster losses and climate change, that is a big topic for another day. I just got back I mentioned I was in Portland in a meeting with a lot of folks who think about risk, including some insurance industry folks. I think it'll be interesting to have that conversation a little bit down the line in a future session. I don't think there's any sudden brand new information just this week that changes the big picture, but there are certainly legitimate concerns. So I think that's a worthwhile conversation to have. It's a question from Pierre about how this might affect other University of California campuses, specifically UCR, so presumably UC Riverside. It's unclear. I'm not the qualified person to talk about this. I also know that UC administrators probably aren't going to be extremely forthcoming about the potential consequences, other than that they are fairly dire. Obviously, right now, the biggest focus is on UCLA. But again, a lot of the research cuts, to UCLA involve grants that are to multiple UC campuses. So it's not at all unusual for UCLA researchers to be on the same federal grant as, say, UC Riverside or UC San Diego or UC Davis or something. So there will be knock-on effects, certainly. And for the overall top-line budget of the UC system, there is some contribution by campuses. UCLA is one of the larger campuses, as well as one of the more research funding intensive, bringing in the funding campuses. So this is a pretty big deal. Beyond that, I don't think I'm the right person to ask about specifics. More importantly, I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't opine further on that for now. Except to say that, again, $1 billion is a big number, not just from a UCLA only perspective, but even from a UC system-wide perspective, given that it would come all at once and unexpectedly. Mary mentions, there's a lot of PhD students who are going to have to start over in a different program. That's true, although the funding situation is so bad right now across the board at virtually all universities in the country, public and private. Actually, I think that most PhD students who lose their funding, not all, so don't lose hope. There will be some people who find other programs and alternative funding sources, but unfortunately, I would say the majority probably will not be able to continue their PhD in this country. And some may continue their PhD in another country, but even that becomes progressively more difficult. I think a lot of people probably will not, at this time, be able to continue their doctorate studies in whatever field they're in, because there really aren't a lot of alternatives right now, because it's not just UCLA, it's not just UC system, it's every university in the country right now. In fact, for this fall application cycle, there are some universities and some departments that are not accepting new PhD students because they simply cannot support them. That is where we are right now in higher education, and there are further cliffs looming. Sam points out that there are a significant number of individuals or groups that could potentially provide $1 billion to the UC system. Mathematically, that is true. There are a lot of people now and entities in the world that have a lot more than $1 billion to their name. I'm not sure that that's a sustainable model in the long run, but there are potentially some creative solutions that could exist out there. There's a lot of important things that need to be done in the world with $1 billion. So I think high wealth individuals or entities probably have to make decisions about whether that's the most appropriate use of $1 billion with a B. But, I can say that I know that some private entities are stepping up and offering alternatives, nowhere near the scale we need to replace the federal government, but there are going to be some gaps that are filled that way, which is good, and hopefully we'll see more of that. I'll actually have, at some point I'll be able to say more about what's going on behind the scenes there, at least in the climate world. But there are some cogs moving, but so far it's a small fraction, and it's not realistic to expect that the philanthropic or private sector is going to be able to fully scale up. We're talking about a few percent of the total losses potentially being picked up right now by private philanthropy is kind of what the order of magnitude that I'm seeing. So optimistically, maybe 5%, but the other 95% remains a loss. So we will have to see how that goes. But there is a scaling up of ambition, as an allusion to my 1.5 degree monologue. There has been a scaling up of ambition, I think, in recent weeks and months in response to what's going on at the federal level in the U.S. And so we may not see it politically in terms of a scaling up of ambition, but there are some things happening behind the scenes. Is it enough? I don't know. Probably not yet where we are, but is it a start? Maybe. So maybe that's a good note to leave it on today, and to encourage folks to check out the video that I posted earlier today on 1.5 degrees centigrade, and also to follow up on Marilyn's comment there on the public comment for the endangerment finding regarding greenhouse gases via the EPA. In fact, I can actually share for you an additional link before I go. This is the direct URL for commenting on the critical review, actually. So not the EPA report, but the DOE critical assessment report that purports to be the scientific basis for reconsideration of that EPA endangerment finding. I have just posted a direct link to the place where you can go make comments in the Federal Register. So with that, I think I'll close it for the day. Thanks all for listening. I do appreciate the comments section today. Keeping it civil. Greatly appreciated. Let's keep that up in the future. With that, stay cool out there. Enjoy the cool down to come. And then I guess another heat wave looms later in August. We'll talk about that later. All right. Bye for now.